All right, I think we'll get started. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center and to this Washington History Seminar session. I'm Christian Osterman. I direct the Center's History and Public Policy program, and as always, have the great pleasure and privilege to co-chair this Washington History Seminar session with my colleague from George Washington University, Professor Eric Arneson, who will introduce our speaker in just a moment. Let me just, as always, thank those who are involved in bringing about these events. They don't happen just by themselves. Amanda Perry and Pete Bierstecker all the way in their back on my staff, Amanda on the staff of the National History Center, which is, of course, the institutional co-sponsor here of the seminar, do a great deal, do really the heavy lifting in getting us organized, getting the word out, and getting us all assembled here for this session. As always, we'd like to thank our sponsors, the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations, Schaefer, that generously supports this activity with a grant, as well as the George Washington University History Department and a number of individual donors. And as always, we hope that you will join the ranks of those at some stage if you haven't already. Let me acknowledge the co-chair emeritus, William Roger Lewis, can be with us here today, and then alert you to a special Washington History Seminar session tomorrow. Tomorrow at 4 p.m., same time, with Professor Amitav Ghosh on the Great Derangement, Climate Change and the Unthinkable. Tomorrow at 4 p.m., same place. Here, we would love for all of you to join us if you're interested. I think it'll be a very, very special and interesting presentation. Next week, we have Alice Kaplan from Yale University on Looking for a Stranger, Albert Camus and the Life of a Literary Classic. So venturing a little bit outside of our focus on political history, broadly speaking. I think that's everything, except for, let me just say that we're delighted about today's lecture by Frank Settle. It is part of a series of events that are taking place this spring in celebration of the 70th anniversary of the Marshall Plan. In that context, I've been asked to draw your attention to a symposium that's taking place on June 5th of this year, sponsored by the George Marshall International Center, a number of other institutions. It will take place in Leesburg, and Dr. Janka, where are you? If you're interested, please be in touch with Dr. Janka over there, who is coordinating this effort. Today we're looking at a slightly different aspect of Marshall's legacy. Nonetheless, we're delighted to be part of this. And with that, I'll turn it over to Eric.
Thank you, Christian. One last piece of business. If you've got one of these, please turn it to silent or vibrate. All too often they go off in the middle of a session. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker this afternoon, Frank Settle, a professor emeritus of chemistry at Washington and Lee University. He also has taught at Virginia Military Institute from 1964 to 1992. And before coming to Washington and Lee in 1998, he was a visiting professor at the U.S. Air Force Academy, a consultant to the Los Alamos National Laboratory, and a program officer at the National Science Foundation. Dr. Settle developed and taught interdisciplinary courses on nuclear history, weapons of mass destruction, and nuclear power. And he currently directs the Alsos Digital Library for Nuclear Issues. And this afternoon, he will be speaking on the subject of his new book, General George C. Marshall and the Atomic Bomb.
Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. It's an august audience that I'm addressing. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with Marshall. Unfortunately, many of today's students and the younger generation really are not familiar with Marshall. Marshall, the best you can do really with a class of students, when you say Marshall, they'll say Marshall Plan, maybe. But as far as generals in the Second World War, no. He doesn't appear as a general in the Second World War as far as the younger generation is concerned. What I'd like to do today is take you through the beginnings of the Manhattan Project to the dropping of the bombs on Japan through Marshall's eyes as best I can do. There's another part of the book that deals with Secretary of State and Secretary of War, Secretary of Defense. We won't have time to do that today, but I'm more excited. I think the more exciting part is the Manhattan Project and the decision to drop the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
It's on.
Maybe I'll be a rock star and do it this way. I like to move around anyway, so I think it'll work better. Marshall was the only high-level official in the U.S. government who was privy to the decisions regarding nuclear weapons for the first 10 years of the nuclear era. As Chief of Staff of the Army, he had the ultimate responsibility for the Manhattan Project, and he certainly directed the invasion, not the invasion, but the Pacific Theater as against the Japanese. Then Truman called him back in 1947 to be Secretary of State. He confronted a number of nuclear issues which we won't have time to deal with, i.e. the Berlin crisis. It's very interesting to note his behavior during the Berlin crisis as we face a crisis today. I only wish that we had General Marshall. I hope General Mattis can rise to the occasion. I think he may. And then lastly, President Truman called Marshall back in September 1950 to help mobilize America for the Korean War. And each time Marshall responded to the call of duty. Truman said that he thought Marshall was the greatest man in the 20th century. And it's ironic to me that he gets as little press as he does. I think he appeared on the cover of Time magazine 6 or 8 times, so that's not bad. But Marshall was a very self-effacing person, and it makes it very difficult to write any kind of book about Marshall, especially his views on the atomic weapons. He's a very private person, as you well know. Well, let's give you, here's what I want to do today. I'll give you a little introduction. You historians have to have a tiny bit of science. I'm not going to immerse you in it, but you got to have a little bit to understand the magnitude of the Manhattan Project that Marshall oversaw. And then we'll talk about the Manhattan Project, the bomb, the options for ending the war, and the use of the bomb on Japan, and finally Marshall's views on the use of the bomb and his view on the future of the bomb. Marshall was a cadet at VMI. I think he graduated in 1908. He was not a superstar as far as academics go. He was majored in civil engineering, but he was first captain of the Corps, which was the which portended his role, his leadership role in his later career. Marshall served with General General Pershing in the First World War. He was very able at logistics, and he was able to move troops and helped General Pershing a lot in that respect. Marshall went to the officer school at Fort Leavenworth, and he excelled there in academics. Then he went to, among other postings, to the Philippines, to the National Guard in Illinois. But then he wound up at the infantry school at Fort Benning. And Marshall is there in the center. He reformed infantry tactics. It was very instrumental in formulating many of the tactics that were used in World War II. He also trained the officer corps. And among his students were Ridgway, Bradley, names that you probably recognize. Now, we come to Marshall's selection as Chief of Staff. Marshall almost blew it when he was Deputy Chief of Staff. There was a meeting with a lot of the buckety-bucks, military buckety-bucks. Roosevelt was enamored with airplanes. Whenever Roosevelt got enamored with something, he got over-enamored with it. And he thought that they needed thousands of airplanes. And he proposed this to the room. And the people, the generals in the room, nobody said anything. When it came to Marshall, Marshall said, "I think it's a bad idea." Roosevelt said, "What do you think, George?" And Marshall said, "I think it's a bad idea." After the meeting, all the people in the room said, "Your career is toast." But thanks to Harry Hopkins and General Pershing, Marshall Truman selected Marshall as Army Chief of Staff. Roosevelt said it was the best of a bunch of poor choices. Marshall was not enamored with Roosevelt. So they started off not the way they wound up. They wound up with Roosevelt telling Marshall he could not lead the invasion of Europe because I can't sleep if you're not in Washington. So basically what started off as a kind of a cool relationship wound up as a very tight relationship. Marshall's involvement with the bomb started with a letter and a phone call. The phone call came about 3 a.m. on the morning of September the 1st, the morning that Marshall was to be sworn in as Chief of Staff of the Army. The phone call said the Germans have invaded Poland. The letter was written on August 2nd, 1939 by Albert Einstein. And well, not by Einstein. A lot of people say it's Einstein's letter. It's not Einstein's letter. It's Leo Szilard's letter. Einstein signed it. Okay? So, we'll come back to the letter in a minute. Here's Marshall being sworn in. You notice anything different there? What do you notice? Chief of Staff of the Army. Wouldn't you expect him to be in uniform? He's not in uniform because he did not want to project a military presence when we were not engaged actively in World War II. So Marshall's sworn in as in civilian clothes. Now, so much for the introduction. The initial science and organization. We're going to whip through this pretty fast. In 1938, a team in Berlin, Germany, Otto Hahn, Fritz Strassmann, and Lise Meitner, who was not in Berlin at the time. Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann were chemists. Lise Meitner was a physicist. And basically, the chemists got the evidence for fission, but they didn't know what they had. They sent the information to Meitner, who was in Sweden, and she interpreted the data as nuclear fission, that is, splitting the atom. Okay? Now, another person in the play, the saga, is Leo Szilard. I should have Szilard's picture. He's a wild Hungarian. We don't have time to deal with Leo. Not too many people did. But they'll recognize not only do you have fission, but you have the possibility of a chain reaction. So you understand the chain reaction? I'm showing you the first two generations. In a nuclear weapon, you need 80 generations in about a microsecond. The last generation creates most of the energy. Okay? The good news was the possibility of a chain reaction. The bad news was the scientists discovered that U-235 was the isotope that underwent fission, and most of uranium was U-238. So you got a problem. And this really was the problem that the Manhattan Project had. Enrich uranium enough so that it has a large percentage of 235 to make a bomb. And as a chemist, I get upset with the physicists who get all the credit for the bomb. They really wouldn't have had diddly squat if we hadn't figured out ways to give them the material to work with. The metallurgists, the chemists, and the chemical engineers, anybody can make a bomb if you give them 235. Okay, that's my bias. Okay, now we come to the letter. Leo Szilard, Einstein, Edward Teller, and Eugene Wigner drove out to Albert Einstein's summer home on Long Island. The idea was that these refugee physicists had no clout. They recognized the potential for nuclear weapons. They had no clout, though, since they were immigrant, and they knew Einstein had the name, so they went to Einstein, told him about this possibility. Basically, Szilard wrote the letter, and Einstein signed it. The letter was delivered to President Roosevelt on October 6th, 7th, 8th, somewhere along there. You notice that it was written on August 15th. There was a little bit of a delay. The messenger boy was Alexander Sachs. Alexander Sachs was a layman executive who was good friends with President Roosevelt. Somehow Szilard had made friends with him too. So instead of dropping it in the mailbox, they gave it to Alexander Sachs. And Sachs had the president's attention, and basically, some of you know the story, the president said, after reading the letter, "Alex, does this mean that the Germans want to blow us up?" And then he said, of course, Sachs said, yes. President Roosevelt said, "This demands action." Well, unfortunately, he appointed Lyman Briggs, who was the head of the National Bureau of Standards, an agricultural chemist, to head a committee to investigate this. And the committee really didn't, it sort of languished. It was an academic committee. I guess they had a lot of meetings and talked a lot. And it didn't do much. But along comes this guy, Vannevar Bush. Vannevar Bush was head of the Carnegie Institution. He was an MIT electrical engineer, and he was very interested in the nation's defense research program. Among those programs was the atomic bomb. And Bush became aggravated with Lyman Briggs' committee and said they're not moving fast enough. He goes to the president and says, "We need more action." And the president says, "Okay, I'm going to appoint a top policy committee." And here's where Marshall comes in. As if Marshall didn't have enough to do already, President Roosevelt appointed him as Army Chief of Staff to the top policy group. So the group, you know, Secretary of War Stimson, Vannevar Bush, James Conant was a chemist and the president of Harvard University. He had worked on poisonous gas warfare in World War I, during World War I. What they came up with was something called tube alloys, the code name. And it basically was divided into the science in the engineering. The scientists many were well-known scientists. Arthur Compton, E.O. Lawrence, Harold Urey. These people were Nobel Prize-winning caliber scientists. Conant was to head that group. And notice over here, though, what the U.S. had at an advantage was engineering capability. And you notice the planning board was Murphy, I think he was chairman of Standard Oil. You have Union Carbide, Kellogg, Westinghouse. This was a recognition that it was going to be not a laboratory experiment, but an industrial project. So, Bush sends that to Roosevelt, and Roosevelt responds on March the 11th, I'm greatly interested in your report, and I return it to you. I think the whole thing should be pushed. I have no objection to turn it over to the War Department. Well, the War Department was the U.S. Army, and that's where Marshall comes in. He's the head of he's the chief of staff of the Army. And then this was sort of a preliminary okay. This was the full speed okay. Bush wants to really pull out all the throttles. And Roosevelt says, okay, let's go with a big push, but I think you better keep this in your sink. Now, one other scientific development. In December 1940, a chemist named Glenn Seaborg, working at the University of California with E.O. Lawrence, discovered a new element, plutonium. And you might say, whoopee-doo, a new element. What's that got to do with all this? Well, it turns out this new element was also fissionable. So now we have two routes to the atomic bomb. Okay? But how do you make plutonium? You make plutonium in a nuclear reactor. And the very first nuclear reactor was at the University of Chicago under the stands of Stagg Field. The significance of this was a controlled chain reaction, but the real significance was this is the way you make plutonium. Okay? So, possible routes to fission. You start out with natural uranium, and through a bunch of physical processes, you generate enriched uranium for a bomb, or you put natural uranium into a reactor and you generate plutonium. Okay? There's a lot of chemistry in all of this. There's a lot of physics in all of this. There's a lot of science in all of this. And there's a lot of engineering in all of this. Okay, Manhattan Project. These are the people who were considered to lead the Manhattan Project. General Breon Somerville was Marshall's chief of supply. Bush now had sort of taken over things. Bush wanted Somerville to be the head of the Manhattan Project because Somerville had his hands on all the material that you would need for the Manhattan Project. Marshall said, no way. I'm invading North Africa. I need Somerville. He's my supply man. So Bush said, let's get General Steyer. General Steyer had been the liaison to the scientists in the run-up to the Manhattan Project. General Somerville said, no way. I need General Steyer to help me with North Africa. Marshall said, get your act together and get me somebody. So it's ironic that the somebody that he got was General Groves. General Groves did not want this assignment. General Groves wanted a combat assignment. Groves was not the first choice. So here we have some irony. You got a guy who doesn't want to run the Manhattan Project, and you got and you got Marshall, who probably Groves was not his first choice. Okay. Well, Groves, as you well know, many of you know Stan Norris and probably are familiar with Stan Norris's book on Groves. Groves was a guy who couldn't get away. Today, Groves would not have lasted 10 minutes in his management style. Here's what John Lansdale said. Groves was a man of extraordinary ability and could get things done. I love this line. Unfortunately, it took more contact with him than most people that I have known to overcome the first bad impression. He was, in fact, the only person I have known who was every bit as good as he thought he was. He had intelligence, good judgment, extraordinary perceptiveness. Most of us working with him performed better than our intrinsic abilities indicated. And another guy who worked right under Groves was Colonel Kenneth Nichols. And Nichols said, General Groves is the biggest SOB I ever worked for. Demanding, critical, abrasive, sarcastic, egotistical, intelligent, self-assured, and he had the ability to make difficult decisions. But he said, if I had to do it again, I'd pick General Groves to run the project. So General Groves was not going to win any personality contest. Mr. Congeniality, he wasn't. Okay, Groves had a high-level committee called the Military Policy Committee, which consisted of Bush, Colett, General Steyer, and Admiral Purnell. The Navy had to be represented on this committee. They served as sort of an executive committee for General Groves. They rubber stamped pretty much whatever Groves wanted to do. The Manhattan Project, as many of you know, was the final assembly points, if you will, were for uranium, Oak Ridge, Tennessee. That was the largest industrial building that had been constructed up to that time. It was a half a mile long and 6 stories high. So again, we're not talking laboratory science here. In the eastern Washington, on the Columbia River, we constructed nuclear reactors, and they produced small amounts of plutonium, which were separated in these big buildings. Nobody goes inside those buildings. It's all done by remote control. The first commercial use of television, or the first use of television. Okay? So, the Manhattan Project spread out. The main places that you probably heard of are Oak Ridge, Los Alamos, and Hanford. But there were many, many other facilities that contributed to the Manhattan Project. And I'm working on a map right now just to kind of locate some of these facilities, and there are a few of them. Lots of congressional districts. This certainly was the beginning of the nuclear complex. So you have mines, laboratories, machine shops, chemical plants, etc. So if you think it all happened at Oak Ridge and Hanford and Los Alamos, think again. Number of people that were employed, 625,000 from 42 to 46 in the Manhattan Project. I show you, and the amount of money that was spent was $32 billion in 2015 dollars. I show you this to give you an idea of what Marshall had control of. Basically, Marshall didn't interfere with General Groves, but Groves needed the money to run the project. And when Marshall goes to Congress and says, I need millions of dollars, I can't tell you what for. You think anybody could get away with that today? I don't think so. So if you look at what Sam Rayburn says, when General Marshall takes the witness stand to testify, we forget whether we are Republicans and Democrats. We know we are in the presence of a man who's telling the truth about the problem he's discussing. How many people like that do we have today? President Truman recognized Marshall's contribution when he says, he obtained from Congress the stupendous sums that made possible the atomic bomb, well knowing that its failure would be his responsibility. So that's the major role Marshall played in the Manhattan Project. You can see in the organizational diagram that Marshall was privy to just about everything that went on in the Manhattan Project. And Grove said one reason we were so successful was non-interference from above. General Marshall never interfered with anything that was going on. He didn't ask for regular reports. He saw me when I needed, and never once did I have to talk about the approval for money appropriations. There's a very interesting sort of story that General Groves came in one day. Marshall was sitting at his desk writing out an order, and General Groves waited, and General Marshall said, General Groves, do you know what I was doing? General Groves said, no. I was writing an order for $2.75 from Burpee Seed Company. So Marshall had a sense of humor, but he was a pretty dry wit. Okay, the bomb. And most of you know the bomb, but there were two kinds, the uranium bomb and the plutonium bomb. The uranium, we had enough uranium for one uranium bomb at the time, during August 1945. We had enough plutonium for 2 plutonium bombs. The uranium bomb was simple enough in construction that they didn't need to test it. They felt like it would work. They weren't sure about Fat Man. So they put Fat Man on a tower in New Mexico and detonated. It was successful. The mechanisms are different. We don't have time to go into that today. Marshall's view, remember, we don't have a bomb. We don't know whether we have a successful bomb until July 16, 1945. Marshall was a conventional infantry soldier. He felt like wars were won with boots on the ground. Marshall trusted his people, but he was skeptical of modern weapons. Vannevar Bush said Marshall was sort of behind the times as far as scientific science and technology and warfare. But Marshall, on May 29th, talking with Stimson, said he thought it ought to be used straight military objectives, a number of large manufacturing areas, and from which people would be warned to leave. Marshall comes through in all of this as a person who has an international, a global view of things. He's worried about what's going to happen after the war, as well as ending the war. Many of the people that he dealt with, the main objective was ending the war, and his was too. But he also had a sense of global policy, if you will, in the post-World War. He said we must offset such warnings by the possibility from ill-considered use of such force. And so that takes Marshall beyond the fray in a way. Okay, so now in April, Roosevelt dies. So Marshall and Stimson had a new commander-in-chief. And it's even worse. Where'd that come from? Did I do that? Okay. We can get, okay. Truman knew nothing about the bomb. The closest Truman ever got to the bomb was an investigation back in 43, 44 of military spending. And he ran across this big budget item, and Secretary Stimson basically said, back off, you don't need to know that. So Truman knows nothing. Stimson goes to brief Truman on the Manhattan Project. Marshall says, I don't want to go. It will attract too much attention if I walk in to the White House. People will think something's going on. So basically, Stimson went in the front door, General Groves came in the back door, and General Groves really briefed Truman on the specifics, if you will, of the Manhattan Project. Okay, one of the things that comes out of this meeting is that Stimson says, President Truman, I think you need a committee to consider the use of the bomb on Japan, but also to consider post-war implications of nuclear weapons. So the Interim Committee was formed, and you can see the usual characters. There were invited scientists, Oppenheimer, Fermi, Compton. Marshall was there by invitation. He was not a member of the committee, but he had a lot to do with the deliberations. And if you look at the deliberations of the Interim Committee, you will see Marshall is definitely a voice in these deliberations. This was on the 31st of May. Okay, Jimmy Byrnes, very interesting character. Many of you, I'm sure, know about Jimmy Byrnes. If Marshall had a global view of the world, Jimmy Byrnes had a political view of the world. And Jimmy Byrnes was appointed by Truman to be his representative on the Interim Committee. And Jimmy Byrnes didn't want to take any prisoners. He said the bomb should be used against Japan as soon as possible, used on a war plant, and it be used without prior warning. So Byrnes influenced the committee's report, and that's what they got. So they didn't pay that much attention to Marshall. Okay, so the options for ending the war. Marshall, at this time, became the commander of the Pacific War. Admiral Leahy was chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Admiral Leahy was a messenger boy. He was a nice guy, but Marshall was really the power in the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And so the decisions really were placed before Marshall. And the decisions were, of course, all the armed forces wanted to get their ore in the water. The Navy said, if we blockade them, we can do it. The Air Force said, we've already been bombing them, so we don't need, we can take care of it. And the one guy who could take care of everything, of course, was General LeMay. General LeMay was not modest in his opinions. Go back. There was the Soviet intervention. The Soviets had agreed to enter the war 6 weeks after VE Day. And why the thing's doing? Am I here? Anyway, there was the invasion, and Marshall did not want to launch an invasion if he could help it. And lastly, there was the untried, untested atomic bomb. So those were the options that were on the table. Some other options were, we actually moved poisonous gas into the Pacific as an option. They decided not to use it for, you can read the book, for a number of reasons. Continued firebombing. It turns out that they killed on, I believe in April, a firebomb raid on Tokyo killed 80,000 people. And you say, what's the difference between that and bombing Hiroshima? The difference is, have you ever been to Atlanta during rush hour at the airport? You want to put 400 B-29s in the air? I can do it with one plane, one bomb. That's the difference, in my opinion. Okay? So, Truman is worried about casualties. And there is a meeting on June the 18th to discuss possible casualties. And Marshall, Joint Chiefs, John McCoy, Forrestal, and the President. And Marshall, they're looking at casualties from various operations. Leyte, Luzon, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. They're trying to give the president an estimate of casualties. And Marshall says, it's a grim fact of war, there's no easy way. If we have to do the invasion, we're going to take a lot of casualties. The historians have had a ball with casualties. I think they run all the way from 100,000 to, 2 or 3 billion that might happen. I think they chew on this. Historians love to get something and chew on it. Okay? General Marshall said it was his view that the operation against Kyushu was the only course to pursue at this time. No bomb. John McCoy came out of that meeting sort of scratching his head and said, why didn't we talk about the atomic bomb? And I think the reason they didn't was Marshall was not sure he had one. And I think he was reticent to put nuclear weapons on the table when he really didn't have a nuclear weapon to put on the table. That's only an opinion. I'm just guessing. But Marshall was very, Marshall was very cognizant of casualties. And he said, in a war, every week of duration adds tremendously not only to the cost, but to casualties. The full impact of war comes to me, I think, in some respect, than it does to anyone in the country. The daily casualty lists are mine. They arrive in a constant swelling stream. And he had a very personal encounter with casualties. That's his son-in-law, Alan Tupper Brown, who was killed by sniper fire in Italy. So Marshall not only had a list of casualties, he had a son-in-law who was a war casualty.
Go ahead.
Okay. The military, in looking at options, and there you see the Joint Chiefs, Leahy, General Arnold, Admiral King, who was a piece of work, Marshall. They thought that we needed a definition of unconditional surrender. Remember, Roosevelt had said way back in 43, we will accept nothing but unconditional surrender for both the Japanese and the Germans. So the military was saying, if we can't define unconditional surrender, which is acceptable to the Japanese, the sticking point was the emperor. That was one of the sticking points. Another was territory, but the emperor was the main sticking point. And the Joint Chiefs basically felt like if the emperor was left on the throne, he could tell the Japanese army, the Japanese armed forces in the outlying areas to surrender, and they would surrender. They felt like the emperor could be very useful in ending the war. However, they didn't prevail. Marshall goes to Potsdam. The Trinity test is successful. The Fat Man bomb on the tower. There's General Groves with Oppenheimer. Groves, they both are looking pretty happy about their baby that they had hatched. Now, we come to the final part, the use of the bombs on Japan. Even before the bomb was a reality, the armed forces worried about how it would be used, where it would be used. So you can look at this meeting. Marshall basically turned things over to Groves little by little. First he was head of making the bomb, producing the bomb. Then he was head of the Alsace project, which was an intelligence gathering mission to Germany. Then Marshall said, why don't you take over the target and the use of the bomb? So Groves assumed more and more and more responsibility for this program. So there you are, the committees. We don't have, I'm conscious of my time, so we'll rush through some of this. Maybe we can come back to it if you have questions. There are the orders that were cut to drop the bomb. Notice they're not signed by Truman. They're not signed by Marshall. They're signed by Thomas Handy. Thomas Handy was Marshall's deputy in the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. Basically, it says the 509 Composite Group will start bombing anytime after August the 3rd and keep bombing until Japan surrenders or we run out of bombs. It's basically what those orders say. On the next day, we released the Potsdam Proclamation, signed by the United States, China, and Great Britain. Remember, Russia had not entered the war, so it would not be a signature of the Potsdam Proclamation. The closest thing that was indicated that we would use the atomic bomb was the full application of our military power backed by our resolve means the inevitable and complete destruction of the Japanese armed forces and the devastation of the homeland. This was sent on July 26th. Response on the 28th from Prime Minister Suzuki. My thinking is the joint declaration is plain as early, and we're going to ignore it. My Japanese is not good enough to pronounce that, so it is a Japanese term, and it is subject to interpretation. Okay, so now we've got Marshall, I think, is very hopeful that the Japanese would accept the proclamation, so he doesn't have to launch an invasion. So this is one period of anxiety for Marshall, I think. Okay, the bombs were dropped August 6th, August 9th on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The missions were flown from Tinian. The Hiroshima mission was picture perfect. The Nagasaki mission was almost a disaster. We can talk about that later on. So, little boy was dropped on Hiroshima. The bomb weighed 8,900 pounds, but only 2 pounds of uranium underwent fission. Think of that today. Think of our nuclear weapons today. A 500-pound warhead has thermonuclear capabilities. The weapons designers have done a hell of a job. Okay? These were airbursts, so there was not all that much radioactive contamination on the ground. If it had hit the ground and the radioactivity would have permeated the earth and the buildings and everything. But if you do an airburst, you don't negate radioactivity, but you minimize long-term radioactivity. Russia declared war on Japan on the 8th. Fat Man was dropped again, a huge bomb, but only 2 pounds of plutonium. It's a very inefficient weapon, but it's sufficient enough to cause a lot of death. And again, it's an airburst. We didn't dig a hole in the ground. Okay, so on August the 10th, 1945, Japan offered to surrender if they could keep the emperor. This caused great consternation in Tokyo and Washington. The cabinet in Tokyo was divided between the military folks. General Amini, the Japanese commander, felt like if they could fight on, they could get better terms for surrender. The civilian part of the Japanese cabinet felt like they should surrender. It was kind of the opposite in Washington. The civilians felt like we should not cave in to the Japanese condition. And the military felt like if we leave the emperor intact, this is going to make things a lot easier for us. Well, we made a compromise. The United States announced it would accept the surrender, making clear that the emperor would remain purely ceremonial, and General Douglas MacArthur, who would become the supreme Allied commander. And Marshall had a hand in suggesting that MacArthur be the Allied supreme commander. Okay, So Emperor Hirohito, the first time that the Japanese people heard the emperor's voice was on a tape recording, and this is what they heard. Now, formal surrender was on September 2nd. Notice Marshall is not on the battleship Missouri. MacArthur was not shy, and he's there to accept the surrender. Okay, Marshall's reaction, obviously a relief that no invasion would be necessary. That had to be the primary reaction. He was surprised at the power of the bomb. There's one point we missed, and we missed it in making our plans. That was the effect the bomb would have, so shocking the Japanese that they would surrender without losing face. And then, something that again indicates Marshall's character, Marshall showed a concern for humanity and warned that revenge not be a motive for warfare. He cautioned against excess celebration because of the large number of Japanese who were killed. Groves didn't have any problem with that. He said because he was thinking more of the Japanese atrocities and not their casualties. So, Marshall retires as Chief of Staff in November 1945. How am I doing? In 1945, and he now realizes what a powerful weapon the atomic bomb is. I think he was really shocked that it was so powerful in that previous slide. But he realizes this, and he says, certainly the implication of atomic explosions will spur men of judgment, as they never before have been pressed to seek a method whereby people of the earth can live in peace and justice. If man does not find a solution to world peace, it will be the most revolutionary reversal of his record. Our diplomacy must be wise and it must be strong. And look where we are today. Okay? Now, Marshall's legacy, I think, is really epitomized by testimony that General Martin Dempsey gave last summer. One of the congressmen said, or senator said, the general had damned the Iranian attack with faint praise. Dempsey's response was brief and to the point. First, Senator, I would ask you not to characterize my statement as tepid or enthusiastic, but pragmatic. Marshall was pragmatic. Relieving the risk of a nuclear conflict with Iran with diplomacy is superior than trying to do it militarily. Marshall could have almost said those words. Now, I got to give you the commercial. How many of you have been to the Marshall Museum? If you go to Lexington, what you're going to see and hear is Robert E. Lee. And that's fine. I give Robert E. Lee his due. But Marshall is a giant compared to Robert E. Lee. And it's worth the trip down the valley to see the Marshall Museum. You need to go. Okay? And I don't get paid for that commercial. But it's a very good museum. The second is the book, and I'm not going to retire. I'm already retired, so I don't need book sales to retire again. You can get it from Amazon. And the third thing is the Alsace library that I run. The URL is alsos.wlu.edu. Okay? That's a collection of, it's an annotated bibliography, which is indexed and vetted by an advisory board. Some of you would know the advisory board. There's lots of folks from the D.C. area on the advisory board. So with that, I will be happy to answer. I'll try to answer some questions. Many of you know a whole lot more about this than I do, I'm sure.
All right, we have a few basic ground rules. Please wait to be called on, wait for the microphone to reach you, use the microphone, and please identify yourself. We've got a hand already up in the far, far back behind the camera. Let's start with that.
Michael Binder, Force Declassification Office. You say that he was involved in all of the major decisions involving nuclear weapons. Was he involved in the decision 1946 to establish our first national stockpile sites, which had provision for hundreds of atomic bombs, and in my opinion was the initiation of the Cold War?
I may have overstated. I'm sure he was in China at that point on a mission impossible, trying to get the Chinese communists and the Chinese nationalists to talk. So I would doubt that he was in on that decision. So I'll have to modify that. There's a period of time where he was not. Let's say it this way. While he was Chief of Staff of the Army, Secretary of State, and Secretary of Defense, he was involved in all the decisions. And I'll put a little parentheses and say there's a gap of 1946. How's that?
The hand right in front there, in the far back.
Yep.
Yeah, I think,
You are.
I'm Dave Roll, actually about 2/3 of a way through a new treatment of Marshall. So one question I had, the historian Martin Bernstein at Stanford, I think made a point of how Marshall came up with this idea of providing a warning, before they dropped the bomb. And then they had that meeting that you mentioned.
Right.
And Byrnes kind of stepped up. Why didn't Marshall, and Marshall just backed off. In other words, why didn't he feel more strongly about it? Why didn't he push it? Because he had the power to do it.
Marshall had a great respect for civilian control, and this comes out when he was Secretary of Defense. He was on a committee when the military, they were trying to decide, I think, how much control the military would have and how much control the president and his cabinet would have. Marshall was always deferential to his president and to the civilian authorities, in my opinion. He had a great respect, and you're right. Byrnes won that. Somebody ought to do a paper on the conflict between Byrnes and Marshall, because their personalities are so different, their objectives are so different, their worldview is so different. And Byrnes, remember this with Byrnes. Byrnes had experience in the government a long time. He was one of, I think, a unique figure. He was a Supreme Court justice in the executive branch and in Congress. Truman, when he went to Chicago Convention in 1944, I guess it was, had a nominating speech for Jimmy Byrnes in his pocket. Roosevelt wanted Byrnes to be vice president. And at the last minute, Roosevelt changed his mind. All these things have got to factor into Marshall's backing off from Jimmy Byrnes, I think. So, but I think ultimately, and people ask Marshall, does the military give the order to drop the atomic bomb? And he said, no, this is a political decision. It wasn't, in a sense, I think it was no decision. I don't think Truman ever said drop the bomb, but he never said don't drop the bomb. Okay? But, so my answer would be that Marshall had a great respect for civilian authority, and Byrnes was the president's representative. Yes?
Let's do this side right over here, and then we'll move over here. So come up.
Right there. No, Subin, yeah.
Charles Clark. I'm a physicist at the National Institute of Standards and Technology. This is a follow-up on another vice presidential question. Truman only learned of the bomb when he became president, but one of your early slides showed Henry Wallace on a committee. Do you have an idea of what Wallace knew about the Manhattan Project?
He had to know something because he was on the top policy committee, but I can't take it any further than that. Wallace was the only scientist, I think, in the cabinet at that point. So all I can say, I haven't researched that, so he knew about it, but I guess he didn't tell Truman. And I don't think, was he Roosevelt's vice president? When Truman took over, he was vice president. Okay. Agriculture. But he was a very slow mover on the Bush came in and, got things moving.
Yep.
You'll be a retired Foreign Service officer. I wanted to ask about the efforts to cover the Manhattan Project. My understanding was it was disguised as a district of the Corps of Engineers. Could you elaborate on that and any of the other efforts that kept this out of the public eye for so long?
All I can say, it was an amazing feat to keep it out of the public eye. But Groves was super sensitive about any kind of publicity. And the project initially was named the Manhattan Engineering District. Its headquarters were in Manhattan. And I'm trying to think, there was a name proposed, I can't remember, but it would have tipped off, it might have tipped off what was going on, and Grove said, no, we're not doing that. The thing about the Alsos project is very interesting. The Alsos project was the project that we sent Army intelligence people along with physicists to see how far along the Germans had come with the bomb. And the code name was Alsos, which is Greek for Grove. And Groves kind of got upset about the fact that this code name could be related to him, but they left the name in place anyway. So, but the fact that they were able to keep it secret is really amazing. And the leaders of Congress knew about it. I mean, the majority leader and the minority leaders were called in. They knew about it, but basically very few people knew. There were physicists that I've talked to at Oak Ridge who worked on the project, and they weren't supposed to know anything about it, but they were physicists and they could figure out what was going on. But nobody, or very few people, if any, let it out. The only problem we had was with Klaus Fuchs and some other folks. Fuchs was a German immigrant who had come to Britain and then wound up at Los Alamos. And he was a very successful spy.
Back here, Ray. Microphone.
I'm Ray Batvinis with George Washington University. Given what we know about Soviet penetration now of the project, what level, or did you come across any records of Groves briefing Marshall on suspicions or penetration during the war by the Soviets and by the Germans of the project?
The short answer is no. But I think I'm going to have to leave it there. I just didn't come across that. Marshall was not a micromanager, and he left Groves to do. This was pretty important stuff, so he should know about it. He may or may not have known about it.
I would think that would be such a large issue.
We can't.
The fact that the security.
You have to wait for the microphone, please. This won't work otherwise. All right, here it comes.
No, I just say that I would think that the fact that they had such a huge umbrella of security around it, and of course there was the issue of Oppenheimer and the serious concerns they had about Oppenheimer and the security umbrella they put around him, it just puzzles me that there's no record or there's no indication that Marshall ever expressed any interest or any concerns about possible foreign penetration, because, of course, we weren't even bringing the Russians into the project.
Right. Well, a couple of things I will say, maybe not to answer your question, but Marshall certainly realized that the Russians were responsible for winning the war in Europe, and he was a fan of the Russians up to a point, really up to the time when he was Secretary of State and went to meet with Premier Stalin. The other thing is that Marshall had a lot of stuff on his plate. The Manhattan Project was not the number one issue, and he had to turn it over to Groves and the other, and that's his management style. He really, really had a lot of stuff, a lot of issues that he had to deal with, and this might not have risen to the importance that hindsight would tell us it was pretty important.
Got a hand up here in the middle. Right there.
Right in front of you,
Right
Super.
there.
Yes, my name is Thomas Julian. I teach a course on history of nuclear policy for the Air Force Institute of Technology. A question, you mentioned that General Arnold, or rather General Marshall was the top military man involved throughout the war, but at some point, obviously, General Arnold, head of the Army Air Forces, had to be brought in because his was going to be the delivery means.
Right.
At what point did that happen?
In probably early on in 1943, Marshall and Arnold were very good. You probably know, Marshall and Arnold were pretty good friends. They'd come up through the ranks together. And Arnold had to supervise or okay the construction of the B-29, which was the plane that would carry the nuclear weapon. So from what I found out, I would say Arnold knew about it early on in 1943, probably.
Right up here in front.
Yes.
right,
I'd like to ask, since the key figure in building the atomic bomb, as Vincent Jones, the Army official historian, said, was the selection of Leslie Groves. He was an administrative genius. Could you explain why Marshall, was it because he finished the Pentagon in record time and under budget? Was that the main consideration that on Groves being chosen for this enormously important project?
You'll get my opinion, you know, and I'm acting like a historian now, okay? I'm used to being a scientist, but I'll try to be a historian. My opinion was that Marshall trusted Somerville and Steyer, and if they basically selected somebody, Marshall, and they said he was a good man. And Groves had not only the Pentagon, but Groves had managed millions of dollars in military contracts all over the country. So he was really the logical person to do it. So I would think that it was really Marshall's trust in Somerville and Steyer, and that's characteristic Marshall. You trust people. If they mess up, you let them know. But basically, Marshall, over and over and over again, Marshall is able to assemble the right group of people to get the job done. Not only the Manhattan Project, but throughout the war. And as Secretary of State, there's a funny instance where Stimson is telling Marshall as he becomes Secretary of State, he said, it's going to be a lot harder job than being Chief of Staff, because stuff comes at you it comes at you faster than you can handle. He said, as Chief of Staff, you sort of have control of stuff, but Secretary of State, you don't have any control over it.
Thank you.
Herb Rose, I believe that you said that Marshall, at the end of the war, did not want people to celebrate to a large extent. I'll make a very quick comment. Both before and since, I remember that day seared in my memory, that I never saw as many people so happy as I did on that day in August.
I think again, I think this represents Marshall's concern for humanity, for one thing, and also his global vision. The one thing that you have to realize that Marshall was much more than a military strategist. He was a global thinker. And he probably realized he was beginning to realize the implications of this weapon beyond just ending the war. But I wouldn't think that Marshall would say don't celebrate. He just said don't celebrate like we killed all those Japanese. You celebrate because the war is over and your guys aren't going to be killed. It's not, and Marshall would say that's fine probably, but don't celebrate the deaths of all these the innocent Japanese civilians.
I'm going to take this opportunity to ask a question about the relationship between Groves and Marshall. And one of the strengths of your protagonist is his ability to delegate, trusting people to do a job. He doesn't ask for lengthy memos, and he wants to see the job done. But on various occasions, it seems from what you write that this doesn't necessarily serve him or the country well. The issue of the effects of radiation, for example. So prior to D-Day, Groves acknowledges this could be an issue, but then he downplays it later. And so Marshall doesn't ask the questions, he doesn't do the follow-up, and seems to accept Groves's assurances that radiation really isn't so much of a problem. Except, of course, it is. So in that sense, does his style serve him well? Did Groves mislead him? And, of course, there are no consequences to that, right?
Right. Well, every hero has his feet of clay. There's an Achilles heel in all of this. And I think, as I said before, as the Manhattan Project progressed, Marshall offloaded more and more responsibility. And Groves was not reticent to take that responsibility. I'm not sure. I don't know how much Groves knew about radiation. He probably knew more. I don't know. But there were people in the military who knew about radiation. There's another incident, Hamburg bombing, I think it's in the book, either Dresden or Hamburg, I forget which one. And Stimson was very concerned about this horrific thing that we'd done and asked Marshall to look into it. And Marshall looked into it and sort of, let it go. He said, So, yes. And the fact that Marshall considered the use of poison gas, again, he's not above doing anything to end the war, this horrendous war that we're in. So, yes, I think he has to be careful about giving away too much responsibility. But again, I will defend Marshall and saying he had a lot of stuff on his plate to deal with. And so it would be easy to say, if Groves says this, I'm not going to worry about it. But you're right. That's a very good point.
Thank you. The gentleman, the right side there. No, over there.
You guys are a tough audience.
Oh, thank you. My name is Mitsuo Nakai, a Japan native, U.S. citizen. My question is, how much of the Harry Truman, how much of communication he had with Stalin right before he made a decision? Because I got suspicion that he had another motive for dropping it.
Thank you.
Well, you represent another core of historians, the motives for dropping the bomb. Byrnes' motive, without doubt, was to show the Russians that we had a bomb. I think that's pretty well established. That was one of his motives. I doubt that Truman, the only communication that I know that Truman had would be at Potsdam when he told Stalin that we had a nuclear weapon, or we had a super weapon. that's the only, ironically, the Japanese were in Moscow, a delegation was in Moscow trying to broker, get the Russians to serve as a mediator for peace negotiations when the bomb was actually dropped. So, but there is a Japanese historian who I don't know whether you've read him. Yeah.
We need the microphone for any of these interventions, please.
It's Hasegawa, I think at UC Santa Barbara, and Sadao Asada, who is a Japanese national, and Richard Frank, who lives in Annandale.
Right.
They best refuted Hasegawa's thesis.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. The reason I asked that question is that I got the feeling that Stalin wanted to split Japan, north and south, just like Korea.
Right.
And he wanted a piece of pie.
Sure.
And Truman says, no way.
Maybe
I
some
think
other
that's my
historian
suspicion.
can answer that. I can't answer that.
Okay. The gentleman here has been waiting, and then we'll see for time.
John Limbert, U.S. Naval Academy. Could you talk a little more about what Marshall did at Potsdam?
Mainly worked on the reports. He did not attend any of the big meetings, and he didn't do a whole lot at Potsdam. He was communicating with the Pentagon about setting up the raids on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but he didn't have a big role in the Potsdam conference. He was there sort of, you always take a delegation. People from Washington know this. You always take your entourage with you, right? And I think he was there more, as I understand it, more as part of that.
Okay, yes.
Thank you very much. Fascinating discussion. Benjamin Tour, retired. There have been a number of comments on the secretness of the project, how much Soviet penetration, and this is a fascinating area. As I understand it, when Truman raised the bomb, saying we have a strong weapon or something like that, Stalin showed almost no interest.
Right.
But they knew a lot. And I mean, one of the fascinating things is that, and it shows you the depth and the intensity of their efforts, is that they were looking at who was publishing scientific papers.
Sure.
And they noticed that a lot of physicists and people in related areas stopped publishing,
right,
and so on. And of course, there must have been the trips out there, these people sort of disappeared and so on.
Right.
So I wonder if you could comment on that. And I've forgotten, for whom was Fuchs working and spying for?
I forget. My memory cells there kind of go blank. Obviously, he's working for the Soviets. He had a handler in New York that he met with periodically. But there were some other guys. There was a young American, Ted Hall, who was a very influential spy and handing stuff out. You really have to realize a couple of things. Stalin, until we dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that catalyzed the Russian bomb project, because he actually saw it. It was in reality. Kurchatov, Igor Kurchatov, the Russian bomb maker, the Russian Oppenheimer, if you will, they had intelligence reports. The Russians had a very active physics program, so they weren't starting from zero. And the information they got from us, in my opinion, guided them along a path, but it didn't give them the real specific technical details. And the head of you know who the General Groves of the Russian project was, right? Lebencia Beria. And if you think Groves was a tough guy, I don't think you want to work for Berry, because Berry would take you out and shoot you. But he was the head of the Russian project, and the Russian scientists thought, well, they could build a better bomb. And they said, we want to build a better bomb than the U.S. And Berry said, you build one exactly like the U.S., because we know it works. And if it doesn't work, you people you're a toast. You're in the gulag someplace. If it works, you can have cars and whatever.
Right. Yep.
I'm Ashton Orms. I'm a retired Army officer. I was a VMI cadet when you were teaching there, but I was afraid of chemistry, so I majored in history instead.
But you had to take rat chemistry.
Well, I enjoyed it so much I took it twice, and I passed it the second time. Yeah. But my question, I spent Army career and then a follow-on civilian career dealing with Northeast Asia and the Korean Peninsula. There was a great deal of a policy vacuum created when the war ended so quickly. And we're still dealing with America's lack of preparedness, to include the not well thought out 3-hour in process decision to divide the Korean Peninsula to 38th parallel as occupation zones. I think you've hit on this. I just want to confirm that I understand. Why was there not an impetus by the summer of '45 to take in the State War Navy Coordinating Committee and those who were planning the post-war occupation of Japan and Japanese empire territories in Asia and say, we can't tell you why, but you better get your plans ready now and don't just assume the war's going to end in '46. Based on what you said, I'm thinking it was because Marshall himself didn't really expect that this was going to end the war. Or was it simply security that it was going to be too dangerous to bring more people in?
Well, knowing Marshall and Groves, security had a lot to do with it. He felt like the fewer people that knew about the weapon, the better. I will say this. Marshall has between the end of the war and his retirement in November, he was adamant about maintaining a strong conventional armed force and not relying on nuclear weapons. And as you well know, that didn't happen. We drew down very rapidly, and it cost us big time in the Korean War. We were not prepared for the Korean War. So that doesn't really answer your question, but it does bring up the idea that Marshall still felt a reliance on conventional forces was very important, not to totally depend on nuclear weapons. Okay.
Very good. We have, final question back there, and then we'll bring this to a close.
Hi, Steve Lipson, Vanderbilt. Could you talk about Marshall's relationship or beliefs about Oppenheimer and like both how he did during the war and the controversy about Oppenheimer later, if Marshall had an opinion?
Marshall he came in contact with Oppenheimer in that Interim Committee meeting. Oppenheimer suggested a test demonstration in front of the Japanese, and Marshall thought that might not be a bad idea. Jimmy Byrnes X'd that really quickly. That's the only real time that I know that Marshall ran into Oppenheimer. I'm sure he did after the war. I'm sure these personalities have bound to run into each other. I don't think, another thing that's kind of interesting, and maybe some of you can answer this question, I don't think Marshall ever visited Hanford or Oak Ridge or Los Alamos. I think he left that to General Groves. Okay.
Thank you. You want to bring it to close? Okay.
Before you retire for our reception in the boardroom next door, let me remind you that, right here, excuse me, in the back of the room, a gesticulating person indicates my error. Let me remind you that tomorrow at 4 o'clock in this very room, novelist Amitav Ghosh will be speaking on his new book, The Great Derangement, a nonfiction work on climate change. And next Monday, May 1st at 4 o'clock, Alice Kaplan from Yale will be speaking on her new book, Looking for a Stranger, Albert Camus and the Life of a Literary Classic. We hope you will join us. Thank you all very much.